The TV schedule shows just one program that first night called Open for Discussion, and it introduced St. Louis to a new kind of television station. In fact, the general manager, Martin Quigley, had to explain that there would be no commercials, and therefore there would be a limited budget and lots of talk because, well, talk is cheap. Well, he said inexpensive to produce, but he also said it would be educational and informative.
On the basis of race, creed, or color, to give everyone equality under the law.
KETC would be what he promised, a place of discussion and debate of important issues. In fact, on the second night, the premiere of Soapbox featured a debate about the route for extending the Daniel Boone Expressway to create today's Highway 40 corridor. Maplewood and Richmond Heights were opposed to the route, and instead of the scheduled half hour, we just let it go on for an hour. Without any network programs to hit, we could have a flexible schedule. In 1954, we could do what we wanted.
In just a few moments, Rand Lincoln, the chairman, will call the fifth session of Free Assembly to order.
This is exactly what St. Louis's Educational TV Commission had in mind when they jumped at the idea of having a non-commercial station. The late Ray Witkoff was the chairman.
Got excited about this. The more I thought about it, it seemed to me to have enormous possibilities.
Evenings would be a few hours of adult-oriented programming. A few hours in the daytime were for children. One of the main jobs in these early days was broadcasting lessons to classrooms. Schools were short of teachers and filled with baby boomers. But we took it a step further, producing an after-school program called The Finder that we put up against Howdy Doody. One of the first guests was Stan Musial. The host of The Finder himself, was Sonny Fox, who before this had never been on TV. He'd answered an ad, came to St. Louis, auditioned, and got hired.
It was an adventure. It really was an adventure. It was the new game in town. And the great thing about television in those days was nobody could tell you what you couldn't do because nobody had any idea what you could do.
For example, a Greek philosopher by the name of Hero, some 2,000 years ago, invented a jet engine.
Well, now, hold on a minute. Did you say 2,000 years ago?
Yes, 2,000 years ago.
And a jet engine?
Yes, I have one here.
This was no live talking head show. It was recorded and shared with other educational stations. And Sonny Fox would get noticed and go on to a successful TV career in New York and became a network executive. A lot of 9 PBS's first employees were of the generation that had lived through the Depression and World War II. They were young, smart, creative. They were risk takers.
So all I could do was just sort of go with it. The other thing that was exciting was all these other people who had shown up to be part of it.
My name's Rand Lincoln. Tonight we're going to talk about bad housing.
Rand Lincoln, who later, became very big in Chicago. Mayo Simon, who later became a screenwriter.
Before Charles Guggenheim won Academy Awards for his documentaries, he came to St. Louis to put this new kind of TV station on the air.
In New York, I worked 3 years for a very successful independent television producer. But I had come out of World War II, and I didn't think I wanted to spend my life dealing with advertising people.
They were young and excited. They thought this was the new thing. Television is taking over. So they were excited about it. And it was lots of fun.
One of the challenges for the new station was, well, there wasn't actually a station until a new building could be built. The first program 70 years ago came out of the Women's Gymnasium in Washington University's McMillan Hall.
And they made it into a studio by the simple expedient of putting plywood on the windows.
Guggenheim, the first station manager, asked the station board for money for soundproofing.
And I said, well, it's not very much money, but he says, but it's money. I said, that's true. He says, why don't you just hire a student to stand outside and say, shh?
But they managed. After all, they were only broadcasting a couple of hours a day at the start, with a lot of evening programs talking about art, about literature, and about the challenging topics of the day: integration, transportation, housing, featuring diverse voices from the community.
Our first witness is Mrs.
It was different, and it wasn't just because the host could smoke at the anchor desk, but he might also tell viewers when it was time to stop watching.
At the end of phase one, we'll ask you to turn off your set, discuss the merits of the views you've heard, and phone in your reactions, your suggestions, and your questions.
And there was no money involved. There was no, nobody was worrying that you would blow $5 million with a bad show, or something of that sort. So they left you alone. They said, okay, here's the studio, here's 45 minutes, here's no production budget, here's your cameras, do a show.
Could I have your name?
That was the beginning of what I think is a sort of a lifetime arc of a challenge of how to use the power of television for more than just selling products.
Because of the work of government, business, education, community leaders, and citizens, St. Louis was one of the first cities in the country to have an educational TV station. The Globe Democrat called it a major civic accomplishment. In the coming years, KETC would have its ups and downs, its fans and its critics, still does. But one of the first producers expected and even welcomed that.
Sometimes the most important things are the hardest to talk about.
So they started giving people something to talk about 70 years ago, this week in St. Louis history. For Living St. Louis, I'm Jim Kircher.